later. Hey guys, I hope you had a great 4th of July. That being said, we're beginning our really work-heavy, study-heavy course load now. It's going to be a lot to absorb, but I believe in all of you, and you all have the resources for success. I'm going to help to ensure that you succeed, but we got to jump on into it. So, we're going to go ahead and start off with some directional terms. So, when it comes to anatomy and physiology, being able to describe where something is in a way that it cannot be confused, a very scientific way, it's very important. So, they have different terms for just different directional terminology in the body. So, you can see this beautiful image I have here talking with directional terms. So there's going to be planes, and there's going to be just plain directional terms. So with the planes, there are 4 different kinds. It describes what plane of the body we're looking at. So there's the sagittal plane, which divides the body into right and left portions. It doesn't have to be equal whenever it divides. It just has to divide into right and left portions. So you can see sagittal is the 3rd image of that man, basically cut in half. Then there's the transverse and the frontal planes. So with transverse, or the horizontal plane, it divides into top and bottom portions. That's the first little image we see. And then the frontal plane, also known as the coronal plane, divides into front and back portions, as you can see in that second image. And it's not really common, but you can use the oblique plane, which is just being cut at a specific angle. Then we have the direction. So real basic, superior is towards the head. Inferior is towards the feet. Anterior is towards the back. Anterior is towards the front. Posterior is to the back. Lateral is away from the middle. Medial is towards the middle. Proximal is nearer an attached end, and distal is farther from an attached end. Superficial is near the surface, and deep is farther from the surface. So most of those are basically common sense if you use some of these words before, just in your common everyday speaking. Other things aren't too hard to memorize because you can easily learn the meaning, like superficial being near the surface, it makes sense. Deep being farther from the surface. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Without further ado, we're going to get right into it. This is a picture of a complete nervous system. That's the brain and spinal cord and all the nerves coming out. And we're going to go over each and every part of it today. So, first of all, the function of the nervous system is to communicate between various regions of the body, literally all across your entire body, to coordinate bodily functions, to orient to and within the environment, and the assimilation of information. It is what controls your entire body, what processes all the information you intake every day. It is essentially you. So we're going to be talking about the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Those are the 2 different separations. They're commonly abbreviated as CNS and PNS. The central nervous system is made up of your brain and your spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system is your spinal nerves, the dorsal root ganglia, somatic nerves, and cranial nerves. That's all the excess, basically. But if you ever have trouble differentiating between the 2, just think of it like your brain and your spinal cord are at the center of your body, and all of the nerves branch out from the center, so they're peripheral. So with your peripheral nervous system, the PNS, there are 2 main subdivisions. The sensory division, which conducts impulses from the body and to the central nervous system, which is afferent with an A. And the second subdivision is motor division, which conducts impulses to the body from the CNS, or efferent. You can think of afferent with an A as going to the CNS, coming towards, and efferent with an E as leaving the CNS outwards. So there's a fun little diagram that you might want to pause and study. The blue lines signify an afferent direction, and the red lines signify an efferent direction. Moving right ahead, what you see here is a neuron. This is a nerve cell, very basic. There are different types of nerve cells, but we're just going to focus on the structure right now. So there are three main parts to the neuron. There is an axon, which is the nerve fiber. You can see it's that long part of the body. Long strands of neurofibrils, which is an intermediate protein filament, generally wrapped in a myelin sheath, where impulses are generated and conducted away from the cell body. There's also the dendrites, which are receptive ends of neurons. Notice that the expanded shape increases the surface area for receiving signals. It makes it much more efficient. That conducts impulses towards the cell body. And then there's the neuron cell body, the soma, which is the receptive end of the neuron with three main parts: the neuroplasm, the Nissl bodies, and the nucleus. So that's a lot, but not too much. There are terms for in the top right corner for whatever I'm discussing on each slide. So if you want to know, those are the things that are going to be on, or could be, on your practical. So make sure you know what an axon is, the dendrite, and the neuron cell body. So there are different types of neurons, and I'm just going to go over them really quickly. This is a lot of text. But if you look at figure 16.4 on page 22, you can see the different shapes. So there's the sensory, like I was saying before, the afferent neurons, which conduct impulses to the CNS. They usually have a unipolar or pseudo-unipolar shape. Pseudo-unipolar shape. It consists of somatic sensory neurons, which give you sensations from skin or skeletal muscles. You have an awareness of these if you touch yourself on your hand or pinch yourself. Those are your somatic sensory neurons picking up that pain signal and delivering it straight to the CNS. And there's also the visceral sensory neurons, which give you information about the internal organs, which you don't typically have an awareness of, but there are exceptions, like stomach pains, kidney pains. Yeah, when something is wrong, you'll be able to feel it from them, but on a regular, basis, you don't typically feel digestion. Yeah, regular maintenance, like a gallbladder releasing bile or kidneys filtering fluids. That'd be kind of pointless. They just let you know if something's up. There have the motor neurons, which are efferent with an E. They conduct impulses away from the CNS, and they always have multipolar shapes. The somatic motor neurons are voluntary control of skeletal muscles. So, like moving your hand, if you want to move your fingers, you're using your somatic motor neurons because you're sending that signal that you want to move your hand. The autonomic motor neurons are subconscious functions of visceral smooth muscle, internal organs, and cardiac muscle and glands, like your heart beating. You don't have to tell your heart to beat, thank goodness. It does it all on its own. And then there's also the association neurons, which are interneurons, and they're located between sensory and motor neurons. They conduct information to the brain. Most have a multipolar shape, but they can also be bipolar. The nerves relating to smell and vision, blah, blah, blah. Like thinking and making decisions, memories, things that you don't feel like regardless. They're just sort of mental processes, association neurons. So now we're going to talk about the synapses. They're very important when it comes to moving messages along. They are the spaces between neurons. You can look at the figure 16.5 on page 23 of your lab manual. So the dendrites detect stimuli and conduct impulses to the soma. The soma conducts impulses to the axon. The axon will generate or conduct actions, potentials away from the neuron cell body along its length until it reaches the presynaptic terminal. So that was just like the fancy way of saying that it carries this message forward. Don't think of this as a continuous flow of electrical energy. The action potential is carried along the axon, stopping when it reaches the end. It's a very mechanical process. The short gap at the end between neurons is the synapse. This is where neurotransmitters corresponding to the electrical signal being conducted are released. The neurotransmitters flow across the synapse and are received by the next neuron, like a wave. So note that neurons can be very long, over a meter sometimes. Kind of crazy when you think about it because they're so small, but you know. Here's some structural things. When I was talking about polar and bipolar neurons, this is what this is. So the first image is of a multipolar neuron. You can see where the soma is. Then you have the bipolar neuron, which has those two ends, dendrites and terminal. You can see that the soma is in the middle there. And then the unipolar neuron has the cell body off of the whole structure. Glial cells, however you want to pronounce it. Oh, that's another thing. These all have pretty complex scientific names. Some of them have pretty accepted pronunciations, but otherwise, there's really no one's gonna like tell you you're saying something completely wrong if you have a special way of saying it, you know. It's just supposed to be sort of the universal words for these cells. So, if it bothers you that I say glial or glial, let me know so I can choose a pronunciation. But I think for right now, I'll just say glial. So, associated with the peripheral nervous system, you have Schwann cells, which are only associated with the peripheral nervous system. They wrap and insulate axons. And with the central nervous system, we have oligodendrocytes, which produce myelin in the central nervous system. This is the white matter of the spinal cord and the brain. That's pretty important. You have the microglial cells. They are phagocytic. They digest foreign materials, which is what that word means. Ependymal line the ventricles of the brain. Some secrete cerebrospinal fluid. And then astrocytes, which nourish neurons, a barrier between the nervous tissue and the blood. Come on, glial cells. So now we're going to get into the structures of the brain and the cranial nerves. Yes, so the brain is made up of white matter and of gray matter. You can see the actual differences. The gray matter is more dense. The white matter surrounds the gray matter. Know those terms. Getting right ahead to the meninges, which are three really thin layers on top of the brain, just under the skull. So we have the pia mater, which is the innermost layer. This is funny, it's like the saran wrap of the nervous system. It is like a very, very, very thin covering that just insulates everything. Then we have the arachnoid mater, which is a thin membrane above this. It resembles a spider's web, apparently, giving it the name arachnoid. And there are two different parts of the arachnoid mater. There's the subarachnoid space, which is just the space in between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. And it is filled with fluid. It is structural, important, and then above that is the arachnoid mater. And then the dura mater, which is the outermost sheath with shelves extending into the brain, made of a tough and dense connective tissue. So there are three major regions of the brain. There's a little picture from the textbook over here. So we have the prosencephalon, which develops into the forebrain. It includes the cerebrum and the diencephalon. Then there's the mesencephalon, which develops into the midbrain. And then the rhombencephalon, also called the hindbrain, which develops into the pons, the medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum. It connects to the spinal cord at the foramen magnum. So just be sure that you can tell where these are in the actual brain. They're pretty significant structures, so they shouldn't be that hard to memorize. Here's some more terms just within the brain. So the gyri or the gyri, that's plural. It's usually gyrus. These are the raised ridges of the brain that kind of give it its funny like worm kind of shape. Then we have the sulci, which is the plural of sulcus. It is the shallower depressions between the ridges. The lateral sulcus separates the frontal and parietal lobe from the temporal lobe. So they're very important little structures. The fissures are the deeper depressions between the ridges, like the separations. The longitudinal fissure separates the left and right cerebral hemispheres. So you can see these examples of the gyri and the sulci. Okay. Now we're on to the hemispheres. I'm sure you've heard a lot about being right-brained or left-brained, and there's actually truth to the things that you've heard about that. The longitudinal fissure separates the cerebrum into left and right hemispheres. It's that big line separating the halves of the brain. The left cerebral hemisphere is usually cognition of language and reasoning, a very logical side of the brain. And the right cerebral hemisphere integrates space and pattern perceptions, artistic awareness, imagination, and music comprehension. So, tag yourself. Which are you, left-brained or right-brained? Then we have this extremely general, the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe. I always struggle saying that, and the temporal lobe. Very, very large general structures. So the frontal lobe is anterior to the central sulcus and includes the precentral gyrus, the primary motor cortex. Also includes the Broca area, which is like motor speech, controls the formation of speech and muscles involved in speech, so it's pretty important. Wouldn't want to get that hurt. And the left frontal lobe. Then we have the parietal lobe, which is posterior to the central sulcus. It includes the postcentral gyrus, which is the primary sensory cortex. It receives sensory information from the body. This material is then integrated into association areas where the sensations are interpreted. This includes the Wernicke area with a W, which has the formation of language and coherent sentences, also located in the temporal lobe. Ooh. Okay, that's all I want to say. Now we're in the occipital lobe, which is the visual area of the brain. It perceives shape, color, object distance. It's separated from the cerebellum by the transverse fissure, and it's separated from the parietal lobe by the parieto-occipital sulcus. Good lord, okay. Then we have our fun little ventricles. We have lateral ventricles, which are the first and second ventricles, the center of each cerebral hemisphere. This diagram points to them directly. We have the third ventricle over there and the fourth ventricle. They're all just numbered, but you can see their structures here and where they are in the brain, which will be important for you to learn. Moving on to the forebrain. We got the corpus callosum, the septum pellucidum, which is missing on models, evidently. The diencephalon, which includes the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the pineal gland, which is the main part of the epithalamus. These are all extremely important for your development. So you wouldn't want to get hit there. Am I right, ladies? Okay. Excuse me. Hello. The midbrain, speaks for itself. There you go. It's in the middle of the brain. And the hindbrain, which includes the pons, the medulla oblongata, the cerebellum, which has the cerebral cortex, the outer layer, and the arbor vitae, which is the inner branched layer. You can see on this diagram where that green mass is on the brain, right there, attached to the brain stem. Together, the pons, the medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum form the brainstem, actually, all together. It's not just one solid structure. There you go with the thalamus, the pineal gland, hypothalamus, pituitary gland, the pons, the medulla oblongata, and the brainstem. So these are all just little points of reference so you can see where exactly they are structure-wise. Oh boy, the cranial nerves. Yeah, these are not going to be seen on any sort of models. You're just going to have to study this particular slide pretty carefully. I think there are tables of this referenced in the lab manual. This slide exactly will probably be on your practical when I come to cranial nerves, or the section I'm going to do on cranial nerves. So just be sure to memorize these names of these areas. So we have the olfactory tract, the optic nerve, the oculomotor nerve, the trochlear nerve, the trigeminal nerve, the abducens nerve, the facial nerve, the vestibulocochlear nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, the vagus nerve, the accessory nerve, and the hypoglossal nerve. And I always say the best way to memorize stuff like this is a mnemonic device. So right here we have a really strange one, and there is a typo that should say vacations, not vacatompins. Old Oliver Og traveled to Africa for very good vacations and holidays, is what that should say. But you can make up your own. I find that making them silly or borderline inappropriate helps. So if you can come up with something ridiculous, it'll probably help you memorize it more quickly. You're going to need to know all 12 of these. Moving on to the spinal cord, we have the longitudinal aspect. It terminates at the conus medullaris, attaches to the coccyx by a thin thread of connective tissue called the filum terminale. It has neural continuation of parallel nerve fibers inferior to the conus medullaris, called the quadra equina. And you can see, oh gosh, I hope that's not in the way. Can I move this? No? Okay, well, that's the filum terminale. Okay. Hello. Next. Okay. Then we have cross sections of the spinal cord, including more white matter and more gray matter. So there's the dorsal column, the lateral column, and the ventral column for both of these. So this is why it's important to learn the directional terms so that you won't have to think so hard when you hear the word dorsal, lateral, or ventral. You just have to think it's forward, side, and back. You have the dorsal horn, the lateral horn, and the ventral horn when it comes to the gray matter. Be sure to know these terms. The gray commissure, the central canal, all the way down the spinal cord. You have the dorsal roots, the dorsal root ganglion, the spinal nerve, the ventral root, and the rootlets. All very structural. Nerves. The cervical plexus, C1 through C4, the phrenic nerve, the axillary nerve, the musculocutaneous nerve, the sympathetic trunk, all stemming out in the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. Then we have the thoracic nerves, the lumbar plexus, the sacral plexus, the conus medullaris, and the quadra equina. You can see throughout the entire body in these very specific areas instead of just seeing the cross-section now. Give you a good idea where everything is sitting. Then in your arms, we have the median nerve, the radial nerve, and the ulnar nerve. I guess, on either side. And the median runs along the middle, the radial runs to the thumb, and the ulnar runs to the pinky. All together. And then your legs, you have the femoral nerve, the saphenous nerve, the sciatic nerve, and the tibial nerve. A lot of people have sciatic nerve pain related to their lower back. And sometimes this nerve has a lot of pressure from muscles pulling on it, or the vertebra can pinch it. And that's the end of my slideshow. That was a lot to go over. I hope you're not too intimidated. Just know that we can get together. We can get through this together. It's a lot of memorization. Watch this as many times as you need to. I'm going to be posting a more filled out version of this PowerPoint later, so you can study with it. And there are materials in your lab manual and your textbook. And do not be afraid to ask me questions. Please ask me questions. Email me. I'm willing to help out. And that's all I have today. So thank you.